Wonderful. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you virtually. I'm sorry I can't be there in person with you this year. I had some work commitments that demanded me back here in the States, but I'm sure knowing Tracy and the team, you've had a wonderful meeting, and I'm thrilled to be here. I'm here from Amylyx Pharmaceuticals. My name is Jamie Timmons. I am the Senior Vice President of Medical Affairs. I'm a physician, and I'll be giving you an update from Amylyx today on our Helios trial and where we are with next steps in evaluating AMX35 in Wolfram syndrome. So I have a few slides, and any of you that were here last year, these may look a little familiar because the trial is still ongoing. So some things haven't changed about the trial, but I'll try to make sure I flag anything that's new, and definitely happy to answer any questions as well too. So with that, I'm going to share my slides. Okay. And I assume someone will stop me if you can't see the slides. So I will keep going unless I see Tracy flagging me down to tell me that you can't see it. But it looks like you can from what I can see. Um, Wonderful. And what a lovely picture of Raquel and Stephanie there. So you may notice on our Amylyx website and on our slide decks, we have some great photos from when they both came to visit our office. So first, it's important to start with a disclaimer that AMX35 is investigational. And what that means is that it's not approved by any health authority. So by health authority, I'm talking about the FDA, the EMA, those large bodies that approve drugs, essentially. And so the reason I need to give you that disclaimer is that I'm here to provide scientific information, updates, but it's important to know that, this drug has not received the stamp of approval, by these health authorities. And so I need to be careful about what I share and how I share it. And I certainly will be. But it's always important to know, where things stand in terms of the approval process. And with that in mind, I thought I'd do a quick recap of a slide that we looked at last year, just in case there's anybody new, and also to show, where we are in the process. And so you may remember this, it's the drug development process, which typically takes anywhere from often 10 plus years, sometimes a little shorter, sometimes a little longer. And that's because it starts at the very beginning with the idea for a new medicine in a lab, and then going into testing in cells in petri dishes and mice, sometimes in monkeys, to get that initial data around whether or not this drug may work in humans and whether it's safe. Um, Phase one is the language that we use to talk about the first trials that are in humans. And so phase one trials are really looking at safety and also trying to figure out the right dose for the drug in a specific condition. Phase one studies can be done in people who have the condition that's under study, but they may also be done in what's called healthy volunteers, so people who do not have the condition. So it's really that initial data, dosing, safety that supports whether or not a drug should move forward into further testing. If it moves forward into further testing, it goes into phase two, which is almost always when you are testing the drug in a smaller, a mid to small size population of people who actually have the condition under study. And here again, the focus is safety, but also looking for signs of, does this drug actually work? Does it slow down a progressive disease? Does it improve laboratory values? Whatever the hallmarks of the condition under study are, that will start to be studied in the phase two situation. And that's what Helios is. Helios is a phase two study. So that's where we are. And then I put a orange highlight around phase three because that is where we're moving to And much of the work that Amylyx is currently focused on is designing that phase three trial and getting the input from both the regulatory bodies, but also experts in the field and also people living with Wolfram syndrome. And so the phase three trial is really what we often call the pivotal trial. It's the trial that says yes or no. Does this drug really work in this population of people? And does it give us the right amount of data to go to, for example, the FDA or the EMA and say, hey, look at all this great data that we've generated all the way back from the cell models and mouse models all the way through to phase three. Here's our comprehensive application. Please review this and tell us if you agree. And if they do agree, then the drug is approved and goes on the market. So that process, does take a while. Phase one, phase two, phase three trials sometimes can last years, depending on the condition under study and how long the trial needs to be. So it's a long process. It's a very systematic process, but it's worth it in the end if we're able to get drugs to people who have diseases where there are few or no treatments, like Wolfram syndrome. But even after approval, there's study goes on. We keep learning about the drug and the population under study, and that's what's called phase four, sometimes also called real world studies as well too. So this is the process. It's not always perfectly linear, as you see here. Sometimes in certain diseases you can jump from phase two to regulatory, but that's a more rare circumstance. Usually you do need to do kind of phase one, phase two, phase three, to then meet the needs and the requirements of review. So Helios is phase two, still ongoing. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And we are in the weeds right now with working on the design of the phase three trial. So that is the goal, is to move from phase two to phase three with AMX35 in Wolfram syndrome. Okay, so let's go into the phase two Helios trial. So first, it may be helpful just to remind everyone what AMX35 is and why we're studying AMX35 in Wolfram syndrome. And so we know that the WFS1 mutations can cause endoplasmic reticulum stress and impaired mitochondrial dynamics. And what does that mean? So in your cells, you have really important parts that are providing the energy of the cell, what the cell needs to do its basic and important functions, and also to make sure that any proteins that are created are going through the process, are pristine, are not folding back on each other, not gunking up the cell, etc. And so when the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria, when they're not working well, when they are stressed out, when they're impaired, the cell does not work well. The cell can have dysfunction, or at the extreme end, the cell can die. And so what we know in Wolfram syndrome is that the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria are impacted, which can then lead to dysfunction and death of cells, and that includes cells in the pancreas and also cells in the brain called neurons. And so the reason that we initially began studying AMX35 in Wolfram syndrome is because there is a large body of evidence that shows that AMX35 can reduce endoplasmic reticulum stress, improve mitochondrial function. So the things that are sort of impacting the energy of the cell, gunking up the cell, AMX35 is able to help those work a little bit better, and therefore, the hypothesis is that the cells will then be able to do their job, live longer, and hopefully not die. So before we went into studies in humans, we did do that preclinical evidence. So that side of the slide I was showing earlier on the very far left, those studies that are in petri dishes and cells and the studies in mice. And so what we saw when we evaluated AMX35 in these preclinical studies is that when you give AMX35 to cells in the pancreas, insulin secretion is improved, the cell health is better, it's working better, functioning better. Similarly, in the neuron cells in the brain. And then what we saw in a Wolfram syndrome mouse model, a mouse that has one of the genetic mutations that can cause Wolfram syndrome, that the mice that received AMX35 were delayed in developing diabetes. And so this initial evidence in the cell and mouse models gave us the confidence that we needed to say, okay, let's move forward and study AMX35 in people with Wolfram syndrome to see if we see similar effects or see if we see other effects as well too. So that led to the design of Helios. And the design of Helios, again, it's a phase 2 study. So that means one of our main objectives was to ensure that AMX35 was safe and well tolerated in people with Wolfram syndrome. And then the other area of key focus in Helios was to look at how does AMX35 impact the pancreas? Because we had that preclinical data that showed that AMX35 seemed to improve pancreatic function in cells in mice, we were curious how it would work in people with Wolfram syndrome. And so Helios is a small trial. There's 12 participants in Helios. And the other thing to be aware of is that everyone is receiving AMX35. So you may have heard of a placebo-controlled trial where people receive one group receives the active drug, one group receives the placebo, so that you can compare the two groups and see what is the true effect of the drug. That is not the case in Helios. This is what's called an open label study where everyone receives the drug. And so there's benefits to this. Of course, everyone receives the drug, which is great. But there are limitations because we do know that a placebo effect can occur. People who are in a trial can feel better. They can, receive better care because they're seeing their physician more often. They may improve their diet a little bit. There's a variety of things that can happen in a trial that maybe are not due to the drug. And so we don't have that comparison group in this study. So when we compare data, let's say at week 48 in the study, we're looking at the person's baseline. How were they doing when they entered the trial? And then how are they doing a year later? But we will likely need to do a placebo-controlled trial for phase 3. That is typically evidence that regulatory bodies want to see. But for Helios, no placebo, everyone receives drug. And one key difference from this year to last year is that we have extended what's called the treatment extension period. So people enter the trial in the screening period. The investigator assesses to see if they're eligible. Once they're eligible, they enter what's called the open label treatment period. That is 48 weeks long. And everyone has now completed that portion. They've all reached at least 48 weeks in the study. After 48 weeks, we peel back some of the evaluations. So it just gets a little bit easier, a little less burdensome. Participants don't need to do as many of the evaluations and have as many visits. And so that treatment extension period allows them to continue to receive AMX35 and also allows us to continue to follow them over the long-term period. And so we have extended that out to 96 weeks. And so that's why Helios is still ongoing. People still in the trial are in the treatment extension period now. And then at the very end of the study, we'll have a safety follow-up period. And so last year, we presented data at 24 weeks. So this open label treatment period, halfway through that at 24 weeks. This year, we presented data of all participants in the study at 48 weeks. And we'll continue to share to share the data as we have it. So who was eligible for Helios? So shown here on the slide are some of the criteria. Any of you who have ever looked at clinical trials know that it's often a laundry list of very detailed criteria. So I've pulled out just some of the more important criteria here, but there's several other criteria. Participants in Helios had to be 17 or older, which we do know is a limitation for Wolfram syndrome. Of course, we would want to study people who are younger. At the time that we initially designed this trial, we only had data to support dosing in adults. So we needed to have better data to understand what the dose should be and what the safety and tolerability would be in people younger than 17. So that's why we had to do only 17 in Helios. Participants, of course, needed to have a definite diagnosis of Wolfram syndrome, which includes having documentation of having the WFS1 mutation. They needed to have a stimulated C peptide level of greater than zero point 0.2. And so what does that mean? What that means is that people entering the study, their pancreas needed to be able to make some insulin when stimulated. And the reason for that is the main endpoint that we're studying is how well the pancreas, when stimulated, secretes insulin. And so someone who, for example, is very far progressed in their diabetes and is completely requiring insulin and their pancreas can't be stimulated to secrete insulin was not eligible for Helios because we would not have been able to study their response and therefore wouldn't have been able to see, if they were able to be stimulated. Participants needed to be willing to wear a continuous glucose monitor or CGM. And for the first part of the study, those first 48 weeks, participants were not allowed to take their GLP-1 agonist. So semaglutide, Ozempic, you may have heard those various drugs for the first part of the study. So age older than 17, need to have Wolfram syndrome. Pancreas needs to be able to stimulate to produce some insulin and, needing to require insulin to be in the study. So Helios really did and is studying a large number of endpoints in Wolfram syndrome. And the reason for that is we really wanted to understand what, if any, endpoints does AMX 35 impact in the disease. And so when we talk about endpoints, those are the Wolfram syndrome signs, symptoms, laboratory values, et cetera, that we measure in the study to see what happens when people receive AMX 35. And so I'll break them down in the next few slides. So one of the main areas that we looked at, as I mentioned, is how well the pancreas is functioning in managing blood sugar levels. And so we have several endpoints that are measuring that in Helios. The quote primary endpoint, which is the main endpoint of the study, is change from baseline in C peptide. And so what C peptide is that those levels allow us to measure the ability of the pancreas to produce insulin. So if your pancreas can produce insulin, you should see your C peptide. And if the ability to produce insulin gets better, your C peptide levels will increase over time. Another way to look at that you may have heard of is the hemoglobin A1C. And the hemoglobin A1C is a blood measurement that tells us how well blood sugar is controlled in the preceding about 3 months. So again, that's telling us how well is the diabetes managed. Other endpoints we're looking at the change from baseline in the dose of insulin that was required, and using that CGM device, the continuous glucose monitor, overall, how much time were people in the target range? So comparing from baseline to over the course of the study, were they in their target range for longer, or did that change over time? So many measures related to managing blood sugar, related to managing diabetes in Helios. We did also look at measuring vision. And so secondary endpoints, which are very important, just not right up there with the primary endpoint, included best corrected visual acuity. So you have the eye chart there on the right. And then also something called optical coherence tomography, which is a non-invasive way to see detailed pictures of parts of the eye. Vision is harder to study over a shorter trial. I think I may have heard Dr. Barrett finishing up right before I joined. And as you know, to study vision in that trial, that was a much longer time frame of study. And so at week 48, we did not anticipate, being able to see drastic changes in vision, but we will continue to evaluate this over time. And then we also looked at more general measures, just looking at overall symptom burden. So different scales that are used to evaluate how people in the study are feeling and also how their investigator, their physician, also thinks they're doing as well too, and evaluating their most bothersome symptom as well. So I think the key takeaway for Helios is really that we went into Helios with a very curious mindset. Does AMX35, impact Wolfram syndrome? And if it does, in what areas and in what endpoints? And really, the goal was first to understand, is the drug safe and well tolerated in people with Wolfram syndrome, but also to help us hone in on if there are specific areas that it looks like AMX35 is working in, to then take those forward into the larger phase 3 study. And so I'll now share recent updates. So earlier this year in May, we announced, and you can, if you want, I don't know if you really want to, they're kind of boring, but our press releases are on our website. We announced data, that we have data from Helios in all participants who had reached week 48. And then we also presented that data at a scientific meeting, the Joint Congress of the European Society for Pediatric Endocrinology and the European Society of Endocrinology. So I really liked presenting at that meeting because their focus were diseases that spanned childhood into adulthood. And so it felt like Wolfram syndrome really fit into that bucket. And what we shared earlier this year is that we continue to see positive signals for AMX35 in Helios. And so what do I mean by that? We continue to see, at week 24 and now at week 48, that participants in the study do appear to have improved pancreatic function. So that C-peptide measure is improved compared to baseline. We also see similarly improvements in participants' hemoglobin A1C. We did evaluate vision, as I mentioned, and as I mentioned, we need to follow vision for longer. But what we've seen so far is stable vision. So participants are basically either staying the same, maybe slightly improving. It's really hard to say though. So I kind of couch that vision data with we need more time to follow the vision data. And those overall measures that I mentioned, just how are people feeling overall, what's their global impression, are generally positive for AMX35 treatment. Compared to baseline, people feel like their most bothersome symptom is improving. Their clinician, Dr. Urano, and his team also report, overall, their overall impression is generally one of improvement on AMX35. Now, as I mentioned, there's no placebo, and so that is a limitation in terms of interpreting this data, and we are careful in terms of how we talk about the data. But the general good news is that overall, people are tolerating the drug well, generally safe, AMX35 in Wolfram syndrome, and we do see these positive signals that indicate that we should study AMX35 further in Wolfram syndrome. And that's really what we're up to at the moment is continuing Helios, continuing to follow those participants and to gather data. And as I mentioned, we'll continue to share the data as we have it. And then the other, main area that we're focused on at the moment is using that data and our discussions with FDA and eventually also with other regulatory bodies as well too, to come up with the best design of a phase 3 trial. And what we really want to focus on is the spectrum of symptoms and disease burden in Wolfram syndrome. A lot of Helios measures were really focused on diabetes, which we certainly will still include in the phase 3 trial. But we've heard from people living with Wolfram syndrome, from clinicians, that we need to think broader and consider the other aspects of the disease. And so that's really our focus at the moment is designing a phase 3 trial for Wolfram syndrome. And as soon as we have an update to share, we will certainly put out one of those wonderful press releases. But anytime we put out a press release related to AMX35 and Wolfram syndrome, I communicate, with our advocacy leaders like Tracy, and so you'll be the first to know once we have those next steps solidified. So I know I did this last year, and I can quickly go through these because I want to make sure if there's any other last minute questions, I can answer them. Can I, my loved one, be enrolled in Helios? The answer is no. Helios is fully enrolled and no longer enrolling new participants. We do get this question a fair amount. Is it possible to get AMX35 via compassionate use, expanded access, special access program? The answer right now is not at the moment, but that is something that, along with the phase 3 trial, we will be looking to think through a process for compassionate use, expanded access for people who are not eligible for the trial. So at the moment, if you were to reach out to us, we would say, we're very sorry, but unfortunately, we do not have a program. But that is top of mind for myself and others to think through how we can have a program that runs alongside the phase 3 trial. Will the next trial have sites outside the US? I can't give you a definitive answer at the moment just because we haven't chosen the sites, but that is definitely something that is on our mind. And we know we've spoken to many wonderful clinicians over the last year who are very excited and very willing to be sites outside of the US. And so it is likely that the trial will have sites outside the US, but we just haven't chosen those or made that final decision yet. Can I or my loved one participate in the next trial? That is something just that I, as the sponsor, can never answer. That is always something, a question that should take place between the patient, their family, and their clinician. It's really important that the sponsor not be involved in those decisions. We never want to appear that we are coercing someone to be in our trial. So when the next trial is announced, if you were to ask me, can I be in it? I would send you, talk to your physician, see the information that's publicly available, and make that decision separate outside of Amylyx as a sponsor. This is another question we get a fair amount. People know the components of AMX35, sodium phenylbutyrate, and taurursodiol, which is also called TUDCA. I, again, as the sponsor, cannot provide medical advice. And so this is certainly another area of discussion with a physician. I would say that when the phase 3 trial is underway, taking the individual components will not be allowed. But in this time frame, that's just a question I can't answer for you. And finally, I saw a post that Amylyx discontinued an AMX 35 trial in another disease state, progressive supranuclear palsy or PSP. Will that impact your plans in Wolfram syndrome? The answer is no. That is a very different disease state, and a decision that is solely focused on that disease state. I know after we made that announcement, there were some really weird AI generated posts that kind of took that announcement, it made it look like we were talking about Wolfram syndrome. If you ever see anything like that and it doesn't feel right, again, go to our website. That's the source for data from Amylyx. And also, as I mentioned, I will always make sure to communicate with the various Wolfram syndrome group leaders to make sure that they have the right information. And I just want to end with a picture of the Amylyx team. I know we've heard we work in many different rare diseases, and one area that I often hear is that having a rare disease and having a loved one with a rare disease can often be incredibly isolating. And so I just wanted to show the team that is going to work every day and they're thinking about Wolfram syndrome every day. And so if you're ever feeling isolated or alone, just think of this group of smiling people who are working hard and trying to solve this condition and many